This is Berlin at the end of World War II, and here is the Axis-held territory. Now that's a very different picture than that of World War I. This time there was to be no armistice when the tide changed, and the Axis powers, in particular Germany and Japan, though for this video I am going to focus solely on Germany, kept fighting and fought on till the end. They continued the struggle in a lost war, and this raises an obvious question: why? So let's have a look into it. Propaganda and belief in wonder weapons are sometimes cited, and then of course the very real fear of what would happen to them when enemy forces broke into their country, and of course the aftermath of the war. Some do actually believe that Hitler and his officers carried on believing they could actually win.
No, not a chance.
At least militarily anyway. The officer corps were veterans of military practice, many from the Prussian aristocracy. They knew how military tactics worked, and will have known the writing was on the wall. Many of the surviving officers said as much in their memoirs later. The last time, in my humble opinion anyway, for what it's worth, Hitler had a chance to win the war militarily was 1942, sometime during the Fall-Blau campaign. Hitler even famously stated before the campaign that if he couldn't capture the oil fields of Mayerkop and Grozny, he would have to put an end to the war. By November of that year, German forces are encircled at Stalingrad. Defeat here would mean Germany retreating from the Caucasus and abandoning their plan for the oil fields. And again, Hitler acknowledged that if the Wehrmacht was to retreat now, they'd never be able to return. Benito Mussolini could see that the tide had changed at this point, so he implored Hitler to seek a peace with Stalin. But despite Germany's defeats at both El Alamein in North Africa and Stalingrad, and the oil fields now out of reach, there was no surrender as Hitler had stated there would need to be. And now it's fairly clear that he's in a war of attrition. In this game, it's the side with the most men and the most resources that wins, and neither lie in Germany's favour. So why carry on? Now, it's possible that he changed his mind, but it's also around this time where events take a very rare and interesting turn. At this time, January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill meet at Casablanca. The main aim of this conference is to settle the question of French political power, but it's also here where they will announce their absolute demand: unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. Now, as to whether Germany would have accepted a conditional surrender is obviously one thing, and I'm not going to pretend to know, but unconditional surrender is something else. The policy is controversial, and anybody that enjoys the study of military history will know that this isn't the norm. Generally in war, some kind of peace or armistice is sought when the outcome seems clear. But from the perspective of the Western Allies, this is, at least in part, seen as necessary to keep Stalin on side, as they do worry he may conclude a separate peace with Hitler. On several occasions, the Soviets did threaten to negotiate a private peace with Germany, and use this as leverage in the alliance. In this regard, unconditional surrender could be argued to be somewhat of a compromise, and the only way to keep a shaky alliance together. But the effects of it are complicated. However, what is clear is that German resolve and determination at this crucial time strengthens. Far from throwing in the towel, the country is galvanised, and total war is the cry given at the Berlin Sports Palace on the 18th of February 1943. From today's perspective, it looks like madness. The war is lost. There doesn't appear to be much doubt in the officer class too. German officers, including Rommel, concluded unequivocally that the German course was now hopeless. But what is important to remember here is that this was still the same officer corps that had the painful memories of World War I in their memory. Most officers in World War II had certainly fought in World War I. They'd all had long established careers. They remembered the stab in the back mantra, which to them was no myth, but a reality. They had the memories of all the mass suffering that followed, and the blame they received for a war they didn't feel responsible for. So this time around, loyalty would remain firm, and not just from the Prussian aristocracy. Loyalty in Germany was firm across the board. Even later on in the war, by 1944, the mass of people working on the war effort were civilians, more than 5 million of them. Much of the civil service remained loyal, the generals, the judiciary, the judges, and much of the army. There were actually very few desertions comparative to other nations in the conflict. Important here to note that the army was itself independent from the party, and Hitler never changed that, and they too would remain loyal. When the famous bomb plot was made on Hitler's life, the army was horrified. Not that Hitler had survived, but the fact that the attack had happened in the first place, as Citino talks about in this interview. Highly recommended, by the way. I'll put the link in the description. Even under unimaginable pressure and relentless attack, the system didn't collapse. People went to work, wages were paid. Propaganda was fierce, but it's important to remember that in times of war, the public are always fed propaganda. In the case of World War I, the propaganda actually worked so well, it was hard to end the war at all. It isn't by accident that millions of people who tend to fight and die in war tend to fight for the country they live in. So while this is certainly an element, it isn't the full story. Italy was subject to it, and their morale collapsed. This was certainly not the case in Germany, and for many, unconditional surrender was confirmation that the enemy wanted their state gone. Such plans had been written about and were widely circulated. So with no chance of diplomacy, why would a country that is still in control of most of Europe give up the fight? There is still a war of sorts to be had in 1943, and Germany still does go on the attack. They're hoping to keep their allies on side, shorten their front lines and keep the fight going. The alliance against them is shaky. There is certainly a change in German warfare at this time. The High Command knew large-scale warfare was over, so this means generals advocating classic warfare were slowly fired. People such as Erich von Manstein, General Kluge, General Kleist, and in their place were, for want of a better phrase, tough guys. People like Schroeder, people who weren't operators like Manstein and who were willing to fight whatever the cost. Schroeder was one of Hitler's most loyal generals at the end of the war, and is certainly a man of little morals, often asking his fellow officers how many soldiers they'd hung during the day. So the officer corps was to change, the style of war was to change also, but the fight continued. The German High Command knew that Stalin was deeply suspicious of the Western Allies and as such may be open to peace talks. Now that might seem odd as Stalin now knows he has the initiative, but such talks would have had benefits for him as well. The Soviet Union was weak and facing a food crisis. Peace now means they'd be out of the war, and Germany would have to keep fighting the Western Allies. Here's a quote from Stalin and the prospects of a separate peace. The Germans were supposedly ready to make peace in return for a satellite Ukraine and for economic concessions in other parts of the Soviet Union, whereas the Russians insisted upon the frontier of 1941. Now that quote and its source were obtained by TIKHISTORY, and I'll link it in the description, and it details how the American and British intelligence confirmed such talks were happening, though Germany and the Soviets denied it. Now it does state that the talks do break down, but the interesting point is the Soviets never completely submit to unconditional surrender until the Normandy landings in July 1944. So from this it seems that Stalin is willing to negotiate in 1943, as he can gain from it. But he isn't willing to offer Germany the land they need for resources, so the talks ultimately go nowhere. So, Germany may have lost the initiative by now, but they do continue to launch offensives. They take back Kharkov in March, and in July they launch Operation Citadel, the great tank battle at Kursk. They also launch a series of offensives at Tunisia, and their strength was not to be taken lightly. When the Allies invaded Sicily and later Italy, the results weren't exactly promising, and they actually came very close to being driven off the continent. General Mark Clark even considered abandoning his headquarters, with the German defence being far greater than anticipated. With this edge, and no chance of negotiation with the West and no agreement in the East, attention moves to securing the Atlantic Wall. As Germany moves to the defensive, the Allies increase their attack, and the typical conventions of war would only further fall away, with the Allied bombing against Germany intensifying. In a bombing campaign over Hamburg in July 1943, 45,000 civilians are killed and the city is obliterated. Many wake up homeless as widows or orphans. But incredibly, not even this was the end of the act, as Donald Wickens of the Royal Canadian Air Force tells. "We were briefed to go to Hamburg. We said, what on earth are we going to Hamburg for? They had been bombed. The whole city was just a ball of fire. They said, well, the only building left standing is the main post office, and they've built emergency shelters, and there's 60,000 civilians in there. That's your target." "We had no choice, we went and did it," he states. He does emphasise that it was not heroic or brave, but this was the new direction of conflict, and such ferocity would not end. So this is interesting, and important for understanding why a nation would fight on. but the targeting of civilians in war would strengthen any country's resolve, I'd argue, particularly when coupled with unconditional surrender. By 1944, however, the German chance of holding the Allies back collapses, and their strength in the field is also falling away. They're smashed by the Soviets in Operation Bagration, and in the West by the Normandy landings. The attempt on Hitler's life does come close to succeeding, but by and large unity would remain. By now, however, it seems that it's fear that drives the fight more than anything. The Soviets are heading right for Germany, and the fear of what will happen to them is very real. 1944 also sees Germany made aware of the notorious Morgenthau Plan. The plan involved the deindustrialization of Germany, slave labour, and the breakup of Germany itself. Roosevelt did support the idea, but Churchill didn't, and consequently Morgenthau threatened to cut off all post-war aid to Britain, leaving Churchill, who was now a side player in the war, having to go along with it. A well-known investigation took place by Herbert Hoover that did actually conclude that 25 million people could have died as a result of starvation. There is the illusion that the new Germany left after the annexation can be reduced to a pastoral state. It cannot be done unless we exterminate or move 25 million people out of it. Now, of course, we now know that that plan would thankfully be rejected, but the German people aren't aware of this. The prospect of a post-war world now appears so bleak that Robert Citino ponders that maybe it was just easier to fight on till the end. Between July 1944 and May 1945, more German civilians died than in all the prior war years combined. The last year of the war was by far the deadliest. And these German newsreels from the time do give us a good insight into the minds of the people at the time. This one states, "They are all ready to fulfill their German oath. I may die, but I will not be a slave, nor live to see Germany enslaved." Generals were being bribed with large payments, but it's important this isn't overstated, as generals were also willing, and many did, to die on the front for their cause. General Paul Hauser commanding with just one eye, General Heinz Huber fighting with just one arm, or General Herr fighting shaking off a recent head wound. The list goes on. The continued fight after the war becomes unwinnable is complicated. Initially in 1943, faced with unconditional surrender, the memories of World War I, and still a formidable force, Germany chooses to carry on. At this point they had other options open to them. Perhaps they hoped that the Allies may give up the fight if they were drove off the continent. It certainly looked like that for a time. The Soviets may have started to offer acceptable terms, or maybe as the Soviets advanced later on, the Western Allies would have a change of leadership and fight alongside Germany to avoid the spread of communism. Later on, the fight becomes more of one of fear, the prospect of becoming prisoners of war, as of course many millions did. And perhaps even the hope that the Allied alliance would break down at some point kept them going. I posted a link in the description of German World War II veterans actually talking of the war and why they fought on. But as ever, I want to know what you think. Hope you enjoyed this. Bye for now. Take care.